Beijing commemorates the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II with a huge Victory Day parade in Tiananmen Square. What message was China trying to send with this parade? We'll discuss this and more on this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report, made in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Every week, we'll be helping you sort through the propaganda with an independent view of the country that we're taught to hate but know so little about. I'm your host, Amanda Yee. These are this week's headlines. The 25th Heads of State Council meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization concluded in Tianjin, China on Monday, September 1st. This year's summit was the group's largest, with the participation of 26 countries and 10 global organizations. The summit concluded with the adoption of the Tianjin Declaration, which calls for a peaceful and equitable global governance, increased South-South cooperation, and for a multilateral, rules-based, and just world order while condemning all forms of unilateral actions, including Trump's tariff wars. All SCO members additionally denounced Israel's genocide in Gaza and demanded an immediate end to the war, calling for the creation of an independent Palestinian state. In his formal address, President Xi Jinping proposed his global governance initiative, reiterating 5 principles: sovereign equality, international rule of law, multilateralism, people-centered approach, and a focus on taking real actions. Participating countries supported Xi's call for GGI, including Russian President Vladimir Putin, who stated by following it, the SCO can become a leader in the effort to form a more just and equitable global governance system. Xi also stated that he hoped the SCO Bank would be established soon and announced around $281 million in grants to member states within the year and another $1.4 billion over the next 3 years. Another important development from this year's SCO summit was that President Xi and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi met and publicly framed the relationship as partners, not rivals. They emphasized dialogue on differences and cooperation on development, language that marks the clearest thaw since the 2020 Ladakh crisis. On the heels of the SCO, President Xi attended a virtual BRICS summit this past Monday, September 8th, calling for a unified response to trade challenges posed by the U.S., emphasizing the need to build an open global economy and resist all forms of protectionism. Convened by Brazilian President Lula da Silva, the video conference comes as major economies explore coordinated resistance to trade pressure from the U.S. As part of his speech, Xi made 3 proposals. First, calling on all BRICS countries to uphold multilateralism to defend international fairness and justice. Second, upholding openness and win-win cooperation to safeguard the international economic and trade order, stating that countries cannot thrive without an international environment of open cooperation, and no country can afford to retreat to self-imposed isolation. And thirdly, that member states should uphold solidarity and cooperation to foster synergy for common development. Xi noted that BRICS countries account for nearly half of the world's population, around 30% of global economic output, and 1/5 of global trade, and that the more closely they work together, the more resilient, resourceful, and effective they are in addressing external risks and challenges. Xi also called on BRICS countries to unite and leverage their strengths to achieve more cooperative results in trade, finance, science, and technology. A permanent exhibition honoring the Flying Tigers, the American volunteer pilots who fought alongside Chinese forces against Japan during World War II, opened on Sunday in Liuzhou in Guangxi. The exhibit is housed in the Liuzhou Military Museum and includes over 1,000 artifacts, from flight suits to letters and diaries. Many of these artifacts were donated by people in the U.S. and China. Liuzhou was a key transportation hub and military stronghold in southern China during World War II. In 1942, the Flying Tigers came to the city, stationing themselves in a local airport. From there, American pilots flew missions against Japanese invaders and often risked their lives to rescue drowned airmen. At the opening ceremony for the exhibit, speakers emphasized solidarity between the two countries. Jeffrey Green, chairman of the Sino-American Aviation Heritage Foundation, described this period as one of remarkable friendship and mutual sacrifice at its heart. Another speaker at this ceremony, Yang Wanming, president of the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, also noted, "This history shows that people from different countries can overcome their differences and unite in the face of common challenges." Yang also called on younger generations from the U.S. and China to carry forward the spirit of the Flying Tigers. China is designing a mission to defend Earth from asteroids. Top space researcher Wu Weiren said in an interview on CGTN that the mission would target a small asteroid located tens of millions of kilometers away, aiming to produce an orbital deflection of about 3 to 5 centimeters. Wu also said that China aims to carry out the strike within the year and that the mission would include an observer and an impactor spacecraft. The observer spacecraft would first approach the asteroid to conduct detailed surveys, gathering precise physical data. Then the impactor spacecraft would collide with the asteroid at high velocity while both spacecrafts, along with on-the-ground and space-based telescopes, capture the event using advanced imaging systems. According to Wu, China is willing to cooperate with other countries and share data in order to jointly establish an asteroid deterrent system. China's plan follows a similar mission conducted by NASA in 2022, which was seen as the world's first planetary defense test mission. To discuss this, we are so pleased to have back on Tings Chak. She's a researcher and art director at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Tings, welcome back to the China Report.
Thanks so much for having me, Amanda. It's great to be here.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you on. I guess I want to get started with talking about the military parade itself. You know, clips of it were all over my social media. It went mega viral. Even a lot of my friends who don't follow China so much, they were talking to me about like how impressed they were just with the tremendous show of strength and the tremendous level of precision and discipline and unity. So I guess I'm curious, what were your overall impressions of the parade, first of all? And second of all, what do you think was the parade's message? What was Beijing trying to send? What message was Beijing trying to send to the world with this parade?
Sure. I mean, I think it was definitely one of the parades of the century for so many levels. I mean, when you're asking me about what were some of the messages are actually written in Chinese, but I'm thinking about those helicopters that flew over Tiananmen Square with these banners that were written, justice prevails, peace prevails, and the people prevail. And then that was followed with, this massive display, as you mentioned, of over 10,000 military personnel marching, men, women, in unison, as long as a display of some of, the first time that China's displayed some of its, for example, its nuclear arsenal, especially what's been called as the triad of nuclear deterrence, land, air, sea launched missiles, hypersonic anti-ship missiles. We know that the U.S. has not yet developed. But of course, Western media likes to frame this as sort of a muscle flexing, display. China is trying to show what it has in its arsenal. But I guess the question is, what is the message? To what ends is a military display of such to celebrate 80 years since the world anti-fascist victory? It's for China. I think we have to understand that China is displaying its process of building a modern army, the People's Liberation Army, compared to 80 years ago when we were fighting fascism and Japanese occupation that lasted 14 years in our country. That was a time when it was a very, very humble, poorly trained, poorly equipped, low technological army. And today it's basically showing that the PLA is a force to be reckoned with, a force that is capable of defending national sovereignty, and that China is not or no longer a country that can be bullied into submission like it might have been during the so-called century of humiliation. And it's important to note that showing this kind of military might, China is a country that hasn't fought a war in nearly 50 years and hasn't been engaged in, military occupations, the starting of war, the kind of regime change exercises that we see Western countries very much like to engage with. So this show of strength is really a show of national sovereignty, of national defense, of showing that this is a country that in this sort of new Cold War climate, really imposed by the U.S. and its allies against China, China will defend itself if it needs to. And I think another important message that comes out of this is this, constant referring to national rejuvenation. And this process, when we talk about national rejuvenation, it's not talking about sort of restoring to a kind of imperial past glory or something like that. It's about the long process of undoing and restoring all the harms that had been done during this process of, encounter with imperialism, with colonialist forces, that century of humiliation. China is still in the process of reunifying its territory to build a strong country that is able to meet the needs, the material needs of its people, but also defend its interests when it's suffering aggressions, to not repeat the kinds of atrocities and the suffering that we saw 80 years ago during the Japanese occupation. And I think another message that was really strong is that when in celebrating both the Chinese people's victory against Japanese aggression, it was also framed in a very internationalist sense. It's framed as China's contribution, not only as a national victory, but as a contribution to the salvation of really human civilization. China played an incredible role in the World Anti-Fascist War. I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about that. And we know that there's a constant struggle, battle of ideas over this historical memory. And this parade was an assertion of that historical memory, as well as the national strength framed in an international framework.
No, it very much is a battle for national memory, for international memory, and the contributions that China made that are often overlooked. Our popular understanding of World War II is that it was a war that was largely fought by and within Europe. And we often overlook the 27 million Soviets who sacrificed themselves against the Nazis, the 20 to 30 million Chinese people lost to the Japanese. And, in the States, we learned that World War II started in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. And that itself is a very Eurocentric understanding of the war, right? For China, the war was brought to them when Japan invaded the Northeast in 1931. This was known as the September 18th incident, and this event had reverberations across the world. In many ways, it encouraged other fascist leaders to follow suit as well, right? Mussolini was inspired by this act of Japanese aggression to invade Ethiopia. Hitler often cited this event in internal discussions as evidence of Western weakness, and he used it to pursue his own aggression across Europe. So I know that the Tricontinental is planning a webinar for the anniversary of September 18th. Can you talk a little bit about this historical event and its significance for people in Asia and the global South? And, what is lost when this event is overlooked in our historical memory?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, at Tricontinental, we love to talk about this battle of ideas, right? And of course, this battle of ideas is also over this historical memory, which we really want to highlight in the event. And also, I think in the discussion we're having right now, both, as you said, in when did World War II start, whether it's the invasion of Poland, or I think for many people in the U.S., it's the attack on Pearl Harbor that really pushed U.S. into the front lines. Also, who won World War II, who made the core sacrifices. I mean, many polls have been showing, especially around citizens of U.S. and Europe, that increasingly think that it's the U.S. that really contributed to most to the Second World War victory. This is really an intentional, let's say, rewriting of history and an erasure of nearly a decade of brutal warfare in Asia that preceded these dates. And so I think September, this month, highlights a few important dates. We just talked about the parade that was September 3rd, celebrated right after Japan surrendered on the 2nd of September to officially end the World Anti-Fascist War. And we also have the September 18th, which you mentioned, or the 9/18 incident, when the Japanese imperial forces launched a false flag attack near today's Shenyang and triggered a wide war of aggression across Asia, reaching Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines, what was called the Dutch East Indies at that point, where today's Indonesia, Singapore, you name it. Lots of parts of East, Southeast, and even South Asia were really impacted by Imperial Japan's sort of fascist ambitions on the continent. And it was only in 1937 where Japan launched its full-scale invasion of China. But in China, we call this the 14-year of the War of Resistance against Japanese aggression, way longer than sort of the 1939 to 1945 European version of that history. And I think it's important that to understand that in this period when Japan begins to attack China, All these Western liberal democracies in Europe were not allied to support the anti-fascist struggle. They were, in fact, willing economic partners to Imperial Japan. The Japanese armies were coming around China to try to carve up China. The European powers are obviously interested for their own scramble for China, and they're committing huge atrocities like the massacre in Nanjing, etc. Meanwhile, the Western capital continued to flow. The U.S., for example, supplied 80% of Japan's petroleum and 90% of its scrap metal, like literally fueling the Japanese war machine. I mean, things that we can, identify with today when we think about the genocide in Gaza. And so I think it's important. There's many elements of restoring this history, not only the complicity of many of these Western states as an early part of World War II history, but also claiming the other front lines of battle where tens of millions of people resisted and struggled and died in the victory against fascism. This is completely erased from this Western monopolized narrative that systematically erased contributions of, socialist countries like the Soviet Union and the socialist-led forces, the communist forces in China that was really the spearhead of the resistance, even though the People's Republic of China had not yet been formed. So for the event we're going to organize, it's going to be on September 17th, on the eve of this 18th of September event. It's called Remembering the Origins of War, Fascism, and Resistance in Asia. We're going to revisit some of these overlooked origins of the Second World War for Asia and for Global South. And we're going to bring in some scholars and activists from China, from India, the Philippines, and South Korea to be able to recover this sort of Asian perspective of the Second World War history. And I just want to mark another thing because I don't know when this show will air, but while we're talking, it's September 9th, which is, of course, the anniversary of the death of Mao Zedong 49 years ago. Maybe next year, when it's the 50th anniversary, I can come back on the show and we can do one dedicated to him. I think in this period, it's also important to note that, there are huge amounts of, theoretical and practical advances that were made from the communist movement to understand what Japanese fascism was, what was the international fight against fascism, and how did that link to the national liberation struggles, things from how we understand the principal contradiction to writing about the protracted war. So I think in that way, a lot of those contributions from Mao Zedong's thinking also contributed to the communist struggle, which led and fought against the vast majority of Japanese forces in the duration of those 14 years of aggression, and really held back and without giving up at any moment. I mean, it's really defensor not only of China, but of Asia and for the world, humanity that was fighting against fascism.
So a few minutes ago, you mentioned Nanjing, and that in itself is another site of struggle for this historical memory. I want you to talk about this significant event, this Nanjing massacre. This was a genocide perpetrated by Imperial Japan that often gets overlooked, right? This massacre, the Japanese perpetrated this kind of brutality that disgusted even some Nazi leaders. And we remember the Holocaust as this singular exceptional event. We remember it as this genocide that defined World War II, but Nanjing doesn't get a fraction of commemoration here. So can you talk a little bit about the Nanjing massacre and China's efforts in the decades since to keep this memory alive and to honor its victims?
Yeah, absolutely. I had a chance to visit Nanjing, where there's a really impressive memorial museum. If anyone ever gets to go to China, I highly recommend it. It's something that you can't be missed. But it's hard to overemphasize the significance of the genocide in Nanjing. It's probably one of the most bloody incidents of all of World War II history. Just to let your viewers know, it was in December 13th, 1937, and it lasted 6 weeks. And basically, the Imperial Japanese Army unleashed a campaign of terror. In 6 weeks, they killed an estimated 300,000 unarmed soldiers and civilians. They were actually asked to surrender their arms. They surrendered their arms, and the massacre continued. And it's not only just numbers, it was the shocking brutality and the violence and the cruelty. They followed what's called the infamous 3 alls. kill all, burn all, loot all. And we saw, mass executions by machine gun. There were beheading contests, live burials. The Japanese Imperial Army was notorious for its treatment of Chinese political prisoners of war or prisoners of war, killing nearly 100% of all prisoners of war. We have, the Unit 731 in Harbin, which was where Japanese scientists conducted biological warfare experiments on Chinese prisoners. And of course, throughout wherever the Imperial Army went, they also created the system of comfort women. Basically, it's a systematic rape and abuse of women and girls, around 20,000 just in Nanjing over those 6 weeks. So it is a moment in the World War II history that also gets almost no attention. We hear a lot about the Holocaust of the 6 million people in Europe, mostly Jews, but also others like Roma people who were killed in Europe. But we almost never hear about the atrocities in Asia and by the Japanese fascist forces. In fact, Tricontinental recently published an article, or in the process of translating in different languages, to really deep dive into this history, the true costs of World War II, and really synthesizing some of these points you raised already about the Soviet Union, because really the war was won by largely the socialist powers, led by the Soviet Union, but also the communist forces within China, representing over 60% of the total war deaths. It's not in Europe. It's definitely not by the U.S. that comes in the last moment. Not saying that one human life is worth more or less than the other, but this is completely an erasure. Over 50 million lives lost between Soviet Union and China that almost never makes it into the history books in the West about World War II history. And it's also looking at, correcting the historical view that, World War II began in 1939 in Europe and not almost a decade earlier on the Asian front. But in addition to highlighting, I think, the Soviet and Chinese contributions, it's the millions of lives of people across the colonies, especially in Asia, that had died contributing to the resistance against fascism, but also as a product of a kind of, the being colonized, the kinds of famines that happened. I'm thinking about the Bengal famine that happened during this period under British occupation. We had basically this continuous extraction of wealth from these colonies as they were also participating on these war efforts. So there's a whole third world history in the struggle against fascism that we need to also recover, recuperate, and continue to tell, because it's also about, defending this history for our future.
Yeah, I want to go back to the military parade for a second, and the mainstream media coverage around that. There was definitely a lot of coverage around like the show of military strength, the weapons, but also a lot of coverage around who attended. Kim Jong-un, Putin. But equally newsworthy, I think, that received little attention was who was absent. Trump, of course, but also EU leaders who, at the request of Japan, did not attend. And when China held the 70th anniversary of the commemoration in 2015, no Western leaders attended either. And Shinzo Abe stated that generations born after World War II must not become, what he said, predestined to apologize. So this just goes to show that there's still this contestation over the historical memory of World War II, that Japan never fully acknowledged the atrocities it committed, and that these commemorations are so necessary in honoring the Chinese who lost their lives in order to, who lost their lives in the battle against global fascism. Meanwhile, the narrative over who the victors are completely monopolized by the West and by Japan.
I think this is an important question. I think we have to understand that this is not one head of state or another. It is part of a geopolitical strategy that really was established after the end of the World War II. So when we look at the refusal of these Western leaders to commemorate this victory over fascism alongside, for example, China and Russia, not attend these kinds of events, have their own version of histories, or their failure, as we talked about already, to recognize China's contributions to this global anti-fascist struggle, and the suppression of Japanese war crimes is part of a geopolitical strategy, particularly in reinforcing the geopolitical divisions that were established in 1959 when a really important Treaty of San Francisco was signed, which formally ended the Allied occupation of Japan, but really was foundationally a beginning of the Cold War strategy in Asia. And surprisingly, when they were trying to sign this agreement to end the occupation of Japan and kind of create this post-war new world order, neither the Soviet Union nor the People's Republic of China were invited to sign as parties, despite their massive contributions and sacrifices. So we understand this already processed post-war was orchestrated by the U.S. and its allies with a specific goal. The goal was that you were going to keep Japan as a permanent military base and anti-communist bulwark to kind of contain these other large communist societies around, primarily Soviet Union and China, but also others like Vietnam and DPRK, etc. So when we look at how Western leaders act in relation to this erasure of this history, in relation to not celebrating with Chinese leaders or Russian leaders, etc., is part of this 7-decade-long pursuit of maintaining a certain geopolitical order, and with socialism still being carried on as a banner by China, of course, no longer with the Soviet Union today. And so I think we can see those continuities. Soviet Union, now Russia, and the PRC still as principal enemies from this old Cold War logic to the new Cold War logic. So I think we can see these kinds of actions in that same historical framework.
One person from Japan did attend. It was former Japanese Prime Minister Yukio Hatoyama. And he actually gave a really moving interview that CGTN aired. And I want to play this and get your thoughts on it.
国内ではいろいろとね、そのことに対して批判もあるようですけれども、やはり日本人として、また総理を経験した人間として、この歴史の事実というものをしっかりと見つめて、それを鏡としていかなければいけないと、そう思っておりまして、ある意味で日本人の一人としての反省と、それから多くの命を奪ってしまったその過去について謝罪する気持ちで記念式典に参加させていただきました。やはり私は出席をさせていただいてよかったなとそう思っております。私は習近平主席がこの日本人に対してこの過去の行為はこれは日本の軍国主義の侵略者によって行われたもので、それを打ち負かしたんだという話をされて、この軍国主義者とですね、それから一般の日本人と区別してお話をしてくださった。悪かったのは軍国主義者の人たちなんだと。で、一般の日本人は決して悪くはなかったんだという意味のことをおっしゃった。むしろそのような言い方をしてくださったことにありがたさを感じましたね。
Well, former prime minister, so definitely not representative of the Japanese government here, but, it was a very moving interview. And, I just think like, what would it mean for Chinese people, for Japan to formally recognize the atrocities that it committed and like formally apologize? They've been waiting for so long,
Yeah, I think the participation of this former Japanese Prime Minister Hatoyama was really significant. And I think one thing he mentioned that's important to highlight, it's not a question about the Japanese people or the friendship or solidarity between Japanese and Chinese people, but really around a fascist militaristic regime that Imperial Japan represented. And I want to also highlight that there has always been a history of solidarity amongst Japanese and Chinese people before, during, and even after the war. We have many stories of during the war where there's, Japanese communists specifically, but writers, artists, war defectors that oppose their country's military aggression and aligned themselves with the Chinese resistance. And there were also others in an early period that were pivotal to building the communist movement in China, especially in places like Shanghai. So I think it's important to highlight that. And his words were, I think, also try to bring that to the fore as well. But we also have to be vigilant to resist this sort of right-wing historical revisionism represented by other Japanese political elites. You mentioned Shinzo Abe, the former prime minister, earlier, and what he said in the 70th anniversary, which was very, very strong comment. He represents a much more conservative sort of revisionism line, let's say, and he's associated with these controversial visits, like other Japanese political elites, to this Yasukuni shrine, a very infamous shrine of many different political leaders, where they go and pay their respects after being inaugurated as prime ministers, where they also have Class A, proven Class A war criminals that are honored in that shrine. And every year this happens. It creates quite a stir between the two countries. It's very upsetting, especially for the Chinese people. But I think when we look back at these kinds of comments and how we view, China-Japan relations, especially solidarity amongst the people, friendship amongst the people is really important, because it also impacts how we think about, the continent as a whole. In fact, tomorrow in the Tricontinental, we're going to be publishing a new Asia newsletter that I co-wrote with Shiran, who's a colleague, a comrade in Tricontinental. And one of the things we were bringing forward is that, in the 1920s, Sun Yat-sen, who is the father of modern China and of the first Chinese Republic, as well as the founder of the KMT, he actually delivered a speech in the early 20s we found was really interesting. And the title of the speech was called China and Japan, Natural Friends, Unnatural Enemies, and basically was putting forward this idea that there could be a progressive vision of a Pan-Asianism, where the oppressed peoples in Asia would be able to unite, to, find a solution to their sufferings, to resist the aggression by European and imperialist states. And in it, he said that the rule of right is over the rule of might. And I think, in a way, this question still is really strong in Asia. I think since Japanese fascism, it really destroyed this possibility of thinking about Pan-Asian unity. To even talk about Pan-Asianism, unlike Pan-Africanism, today carries the ghost of sort of Japanese imperial ambitions. But we still want to have a project to think about a regionalism, think about solidarity, a project for Asia that is in the interests of the peoples and is based in the unity of the peoples. So anyways, I think hearing what the Prime Minister of Japan, former Prime Minister, said, I think is an important memory. We need to continue to sort of fight for that memory to build a project of the future for Asia.
Mm. I want to talk a bit about Xi's speech at the ceremony as well. He delivered a short 8-minute but very moving speech, which I think serves as a warning for us today. And I want to read an excerpt from it and get some of your thoughts. He said, "History cautions us that humanity rises and falls together. Only when all countries and nations treat each other as equals, coexist in peace, and support each other can we uphold common security, eradicate the root cause of war, and prevent the recurrence of historical tragedies. Today, humanity again has to choose between peace and war, dialogue and confrontation, win-win cooperation, and zero-sum game. The Chinese people firmly stand on the right side of history and the progress of human civilization. We will remain committed to the path of peaceful development and join hands with all peoples around the world in building a community with a shared future for humanity." So I think about this speech and I think about, how the U.S. completely cast itself as the heroes of World War II, erasing the contributions of the Soviets in China, as you talked about earlier, and cast the economic development of Japan as part of this redemption narrative post-World War II. Meanwhile, China, which has sacrificed so much, who later took back its own sovereignty and has become a source of hope for the global South and the rest of the world for millions of people, they're now recast as the bad guys. especially now with the U.S., encircling it and continually trying to provoke a war with it. So do you see any similarities between then and now, between the forces of progress and reaction? And, how can we adequately remember the sacrifices that China made today?
I mean, I think there's many things we could say that were captured in that speech and also in this particular conjuncture, I think we are seeing a moment where the world order, the unipolar world order that was created after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and even the world order that was created after the World War II, really with the U.S. emerging as the superpower, as European states had to recover from the devastation of World War II, that world is changing. It's on its dying legs. And, this is when we hear, President Xi consistently repeating the phrase that these are changes unseen in a century. I think this is very true. This is even more true when we look back 80 years down the line to see what the world is moving towards. And as this old world order is waning, it's going to be increasingly violent. We see an increased turn to militarization, military occupation, military aggressions as a response to sort of compensate for its lost political space, political sort of morale, its economic capacities, and increasingly militarism is a response to sort of recuperate or maintain a certain hegemony. So when we talk about the banner of peace, it's not empty words. It's actually a very, very, we're at a very, very crucial moment of human history where there are leaders that want to take us to the brink of Third World War. And if we don't reflect well on this history of devastation, we might actually be driven to the precipice of a Third World War. And I don't think anyone will survive that in that case. I think one of the things that I also really enjoyed from Xi's speech, he said something that actually harkens back to that Sun Yat-sen vision of the world around rule over right and rule of might. He said something, Xi said, might may rule the moment, but right prevails forever. Justice, light, progress will inevitably triumph over evil, darkness, and regression. It's a very poetic and very beautiful vision, but it's not just a nostalgic call. It's a very, very deeply felt reality that's still living. World War II might seem like 80 years ago, but there's still a lot of people who have this in living memory. And I think what's more really important is that this victory, and we look at China's perspective, is not just a narrow sort of patriotic exercise. This is something around the future of humanity, of the planet, and our collective survival.
Well, Tings, I know you have a really busy day today, so I'm so glad that you were able to join us. Maybe to end, could you talk a little bit about, where can people find your work? Where can people find the work of Tricontinental and anything else you want to plug?
Sure. That's I'm going to invite everyone again to our event on September 17th. You can find that on Tricontinental's social media. Just search the Tricontinental and you'll find it. Find our website, thetricontinental.org. And you can also follow me by my name, Tings Chak, on the social media platforms, even though sometimes we're not very good at that, but I'll try my best to be updating things. Thank you so much, Amanda, for having me. This is an excellent show, and I'm always promoting it to everyone that wants to learn more about China but doesn't have much access to China.
Thanks so much, Tings. We really appreciate your work. And, you can come back anytime, and you can definitely come back a year from now to talk about the 50th anniversary of the death of Mao. We look forward to that one.
Yes, let's plan for it.
The 2025 International Roller Skating Open was held this year at Lishui Sports Center in Lishui, Zhejiang Province. The event ran from August 9th through the 12th and hosted nearly 3,000 roller skaters from 20 different countries. We end the show with this clip of Liu Ruhang's amazing performance, which took the gold in junior men's freestyle skating. That's our show. Just a reminder, if you like this episode, to please like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next week on the China Report.
等这个完了吧。
来，感谢选手刘瑞航带来的